Oh, wait a minute. It's already been. I don't know what's happening. They can't see me. It's a black screen.
I can see you.
Yeah, you should be okay now.
Oh, how come I can't see me? You guys see me? I'm making faces at you. Okay, no. All right. But, well, I can't see me. So you guys, I just have to trust you that you can hear me. Well, there's our intro. Hey, happy to see you guys. Welcome to Thursday's Theological Throwdown. I'm very excited to have our guest return. He is back by popular demand. And, oh, yeah, I see me now. I was being silly. Reminds me of that Monty Python thing. Remember that, Gary, the Monty Python TV series?
Yes.
They used to make the little goose head. Correct me. So I wanted to let you guys know that this is an open topic night with Gary, but I wanted to just do a recap of what the Genesis 6 conspiracy is, and just at least acknowledge the common objection to it and whatever is on Gary's heart to explain. And then you guys, I'll let you know when to type in whatever question you have for Gary in all caps when the time comes. Don't do it yet. But Gary, I never asked you this, but you're a contrarian?
I am. I'm a Christian contrarian, as I like to call myself. And so a lot of people tend to ask, what do you mean by that? Because there's a few connotations to the phrase contrarian. So what I define a Christian contrarian as is what my approach is. And that approach is that I tend not to accept anything that somebody says unless I verify it myself. And if somebody writes something, then I want to verify that. So in my research and in my approach to scripture, I try and verify everything so I have a better understanding. And it's not that I won't accept what somebody might say, but it has to be consistent. But I do like to get in behind the scenes and verify it myself. So I tend to provide a lot of detail and can back up pretty much everything I say, and what I can't, it's my speculation or what I think might happen. So it's kind of in those areas, and I find that it makes your argument on things much more credible. And
it's what you're supposed to do.
And it's what you're supposed to do. I don't try and label myself as an expert, because I think we're all sort of learning as we go. And we're always adding to that information, and I'm a very curious person. So, and my approach allows me to make some adjustments in terms, particularly how I approach scripture, because again, I don't believe scripture has any contradictions. So I need to have everything fit. And if you get what happens with a lot of people is that they have a preconceived idea, and they're trying to put everything in place to make that preconceived idea make sense and come about, so to speak. And I tend to want to let the information tell the story. And that way I don't have to worry about whether or not everything's going to fit or not, because it always does. So those are kind of the two things from a contrarian perspective. And so even within the Christian community, I mean, I talk about giants, which is a contrarian fringe sort of aspect about scripture. So I understand that. I understand that there's a lot of people who know a lot about the Bible and a lot about scripture. So I ought to be able to make my case, and make my case convincing enough to somebody who might be staunchly not of my position, but
Mhm.
the best that they can do is say, well, I would agree to disagree, but I can't disagree with the points that you're raising. So
That's right.
that's and also in terms of how I approach prophecy. And again, there's a lot of people that I think fall into a category, a lot of approaches that are with a predetermined idea. And I think where they go wrong is they don't include all of the passages. And I think that they tend to override what Jesus said with what other scripture says instead of vice versa. So if you put everything around what Jesus said on prophecy, particularly, or any doctrine that he spoke on as the word of God, you're going to probably have a lot better chance of understanding and putting things together that make sense, that doesn't have contradictions.
Well, I mean, it all pointed to him, and isn't that the reason they couldn't get it? They were still stuck in the shadows, and Paul says, "You're complete in Him."
Mm-hmm. Yep,
That makes
exactly.
makes perfect.
Yep.
So this Genesis 6 conspiracy is one of those things that would come up in the contrary view but you are able to biblically stand. I certainly agree with you wholeheartedly on this, and I was surprised that my independent fundamental Baptist pastor did recently actually discuss this. I was very, very shocked. Ultra conservative. A lot of Baptist church were taught the Sethite view, and I was going to ask you. I was going to hand it to you. Would you just explain for anybody that might not know what the Genesis 6 conspiracy is and what usually they're taught about it?
Well, I think I'll start at the end and sort of work back on that, just so that I can underline what you were saying. And it's nice to have some ministers who aren't going to totally follow everything that they were taught in seminary schools, because they're taught in seminary schools not to recognize the Bible in a completely literal way or the passages that would support giants. And they don't want the ministers talking about giants, and they don't want them talking about a whole lot about prehistory. But as long as they're talking about prehistory and it hasn't got anything to do with giants, that's kind of okay. But what you can't do after that is talk about prophecy. And so in seminary schools, prophecy and prehistory are downplayed. And so they're given in seminary schools the doctrines and the dogma that they're to teach. And most, because everybody wants to follow, the rules and the regulations and not be sort of out in the fringe areas, they're not going to challenge back on that. So it's refreshing to hear you say that there's a few ministers out there that do understand that, and there's more than a few. So but it's not the common doctrine of churches. So with that in mind, and with what I said previously, the controversy over the Genesis 6 conspiracy, as I like to call it, is what happens in Genesis 6 as a manifestation of the angelic rebellion, and what the fallen angels are going to do in response to failing in the first rebellion, and then seeing that God has created the Adamites, humankind, to be raised higher than angels or equal to angels in the future time. And I say that because we're actually going to judge these fallen angels according to scripture for probably what I would think are the crimes against humanity. And so that's what Genesis 6 really is all about, is after Satan gets his first revenge in Eden on Adam, he takes his second revenge out by having and leading and persuading his fallen angels who have rebelled with him, a certain number of them, to take human wives in the physical world and take a physical form and to create offspring. And these are going to be the giants. And that's the Hebrew word Nephil and Nephilim, if people are familiar with the term, is the male plural. And these were the giant ones. And it's rooted in Nephal, which is the fallen ones, but it's not the word that's used there, it's Nephil. So, and that's the giants as it's defined. And that's not an exaggeration. That is the literal definition: a tribe of giants, a tribe of tyrants. And any of the descriptions we get about the giants, they're in the Bible attest to that these were not just 7-foot tall beings, these were monsters. And these Nephilim are created to lead humankind away from God and to lead them into oblivion, so that humankind will not receive their destiny through the resurrection to become like angels and to judge the rebellious angels. So that's the conspiracy, is the creation of the giants to destroy humankind. And that's, why I have the subtitle to the Genesis 6 conspiracy book. It's, it's the, how the descendants of secret societies and giants want to enslave humankind. That's exactly what they've been doing ever since Genesis 6 before the flood.
So let me ask you this. Why is it that you said two things? You said, one, they, as in seminaries, like the majority of seminaries, don't want you to know or talk about Genesis 6 giants, and they don't want you to talk about them in regards to prophecy. Why is that?
Well, I mean, a couple of things, but the basis is to understand what I had said about why these giants were created. What they did was they usurped the kingships and control of the world, and they set up their royal dynasties. And the dynasties were the greater noble elite, which would be their relatives. And that's been the feudal class that's been there since the beginning. And part of that hierarchical organizational structure that was set up before the flood was the Enochian mysticism. And that's, I'm referring to Enoch, son of Cain here, as opposed to Enoch, son of Jared, who had set up the mystical religions and the sun-worshipping bull cult. That was the religion that led humankind astray before the flood. And it's that organizational structure of the giants and the mystical religion and the knowledge that they develop and the partnership with the Cainites and the partnership with the fallen angels that paraded the antediluvian world into destruction in the first apocalypse by water. So this is the same organizational structure and same beings that crosses the flood. And they reset up their dynasties and the complete ruling elite, the complete noble class. And that noble class controlled for themselves to keep the mundane humans poor and in servitude the ruling elite that was in control of the education, that were provided the teachers, that provided the priests and the ministers, and who were the ruling kings and queens throughout history. So what they don't want you to know by understanding the giants is who they are, and that they keep these genealogies on file and record to substantiate themselves within their culture as to where they fit in the hierarchy. And that they don't want you to know about prophecy because they want you to be more easily deceived in the end time, because they want to bring about this destiny, this rendezvous with destiny with God. And because they believe, from the fallen angels who they follow, that they can win a realm on their own. So they want to deceive humankind, to rebel against the God of the Bible. And so they need to control this information so that you're more easily deceived. So if you get into the prophecy now, you get a couple of terms that should create red flags for people out of the New Testament. One would be is the great delusion that Second Thessalonians is talking about. And then the other one is what Jesus talks about, is that even the elect will be deceived. And that's the deception that they're setting up to have people believe that Jesus is not the Messiah, and their dragon Messiah that they're going to present is the real Messiah. And they're going to have things like counter Armageddon complete the deception. So they have to control that information. Otherwise, more people won't be deceived, or less people will be deceived, is a better way of putting it. And so controlling the information until they want it out is one of their tactical MOs. And they're going to release a little bit more as we go, but it's never going to be all of the information, and it's going to be designed to deceive.
So literally, they don't want you talking about grandpa. Like somewhere down the line, these elite, powerful leaders, even today, can trace their lines back. Some of these can't they? Or at least they believe they can.
Yeah, well, then they can, because they've got genealogists, and there was a fellow who wrote a number of books, and I use him as some of the sourcing in the Genesis 6 conspiracy book. Lawrence Gardner, he was a royal genealogist for certain families, right? And they have these people that maintain these records, and so when you look at the genealogies, I can provide an example, I think, that will at least give people a glimpse into how important it is for them. So Prince Charles, son of Queen Elizabeth, says that he is related to Vlad the Impaler, the individual that the Dracula novel was written on his character. And Vlad the Impaler is sort of your typical noble Celt, and he had red hair and hazel eyes and very pale skin, and was educated at the School of Solomon in Vienna, and a Scythian by descent that goes back to what they believe are the Rephaim tribe of Danu, which is also known as the Tuatha De Danann, that is the ruling giants after the flood. And the only way that Prince Charles can state that is, A, he could be lying, but more likely, because they do keep these genealogies, is that he knows through his genealogical line that he is related to Vlad the Impaler. And for people who may not be aware of it, the Windsors, they changed their name in World War I to the name of Windsors, and they're actually the Hanover family. So when you look at King George, I think was at the time of the American Revolution, he's the first Hanover king that replaced the Stuart kings and dynasties. So that's where those genealogies will go back through, in one of those branches back to Germany, and then back to the various houses of the Germanic and Slavic houses, up and down the Danube River. So they keep those genealogies because it is where they fit in the hierarchy. And the more ennobled those bloodlines are, and the more pure those bloodlines are, is the higher up those houses are rated. And you need to understand that so you can understand the noble elite and the secret societies, because they kind of work hand in hand, and they're dominated and governed by the Masonic royal houses, or the royal Masons, that oversee the top end of the hierarchy and use organizations like the Rosicrucians and the Illuminati below them, and the Freemasonry below them, and then all the branch organizations coming into that trunk as you go up that tree, or that hierarchy of the tree. And you need to understand that it's the royals and their Masonic organizations, like, let's say the Swedish one, because it's got and the Norse one is because it's got a name that might ring a bell with people, and they're called the Knights of the Seraphim. That's because the Seraphim are the watchers that produced the original Nephilim, both before and after the flood. I fall into a second incursion preference for how giants show up after the flood, although I recognize we don't have a smoking gun as to how they show up. We only know that they do show up. But the evidence, to me, tends to suggest, instead of survival, which the polytheists believe, I think there's a second incursion. But that's another rabbit hole, and we can go down that. If people want to know more about that, they can ask a question from the chat room.
Yeah, that's one of the things I wanted to talk about too. To confirm what you said, I remember reading about Prince Philip and how it's strange for one of the royals to marry someone that's not in another royal family. Prince Philip, were they Greece? I think it was Greece. His parents were the king and queen of Greece or something.
Yeah.
And then they got kicked out because they became a republic or something. So I remember they couldn't marry who they wanted, even though they were high and they were nobility, because she was queen or destined to be. Then she couldn't marry who she wanted to marry, and they had to remain married to other royals. And then it is for that bloodline, but you don't realize that, right? Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, and they'll only reach out when they need to replenish the DNA and the bloodline so that they keep the bloodline diseases at a manageable level, like hemophiliac disease or Habsburg jaw. And there's a reason why, Habsburg jaw, again, sort of gives that visual with the, Habsburg dynasty, and they were not, taking in bloodlines that were a little bit further out in distance from them, and they actually, they developed their own disease from it. So it's important to understand that, and that you do get instances like Prince Harry, and where that's not working out very well right now, where they don't, the ones who are not going to be taking power don't have to have as pure of bloodlines to marry into, and that helps with a regeneration of the bloodline. And that's why over the time, because they have to regenerate that, they tend to have lost some of the attributes of their ancestors, because they have to continue to replenish the blood with less pure blood, but not through the direct scions. And so they really have to work and plan those intermarriages for the ones who are going to lead the families, right? So that they can continue. And those genealogies will dictate where they fit in with those select sort of aboriginal branches and families.
There were 12, I think it was 12, of Queen Elizabeth's direct cousins in adult homes for I'm going to say mentally disabled, like childlike IQ. They're functional, but more, at a childlike level. There were so many defects. I had never seen a family have that many in the immediate, they were like first cousins, and just so many of them. And they were really adorable, because they would see her on TV and they would have their little, pictures of her and the teddy bears. And there were so many of them. I couldn't believe it. But what you're saying there makes perfect, scientific sense, that you can only, there's going to be mutations, and they're going to continue if there's mutations on both sides. And then as it goes on, there's mutations on 4 sides and then 8 sides, and it will continue. So I still, it's so wow, because you don't think about these things in modern day, that people would think about the marrying for those reasons today. It's really important.
Well, and it's important. And, if you look at Prince Philip, who, just died recently, and, he didn't play a prominent role from the visible aspect with Queen Elizabeth, running the family and the throne. He's not somebody that was, as he's kind of portrayed, that was outside the bloodlines. He's the grandson of Queen Victoria.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, but you don't hear that. And so unless you understand or dig into the genealogies, you're not going to pick up on any of that. So it's all, like I say, it's designed to keep those bloodlines pure, but it comes with a risk in terms of the diseases that, they have to find a balance on it. And not only are people, they're looking for matches right from birth, but everybody in the royal families, whether or not they're let's say the Windsor family, or they're part of the cousins or distant cousins, when you're part of the bloodlines, when you're born, you are assigned a specific role. Everybody in the bloodlines has their own agenda that they're provided to work within the hierarchy. So their lives are all right from childhood, and they're initiated into the mysteries from childhood. They're not
Mm.
initiated through Freemasonry and then go to, I mean, they're an adept by the time they're in their teens, and they go to a lot higher levels, and they're not allowed to be called an adept until they're somewhere between 25 and 30, when they can actually accept that title. So they are born into this, they are initiated, they are trained, they are taught, they are prepared through their whole lives to carry out the role that they've been assigned to make the whole thing continue to work. Because no, I mean, a lot of people think today that they don't control what's going on in the world. You just don't see them. They've got more puppets out in front that are doing their bidding, but they're still running things, and they have the real money. And none of that money is on the books.
Did you know, I think we may have mentioned this, I'm not sure, but somebody had done research on the American presidents, because we all think we vote them in. And every one of them is related to European royalty. Even Obama, he was related to them as well. And they're all related to the royal families over there.
Yeah.
So,
and I think what they found was Obama went through a different lineage than the European lineage, but the principle is still the same. So, and the family that all of them, right up to the time of Bush, took were, you know, the nexus point back in history is King John Plantagenet, brother of King Richard the Lionheart, John of the Magna Carta, Plantagenet of the branch family that comes out of the Anjou. They are one of the old families, yes.
Oh, wow. Wow. But what's weird to me is that we as the people, so even if we do vote them in, you only have two choices, and they both come from the same bloodlines. So
yes, they are going to work, all the political parties, to try and always have their people who are carrying water for them, or if they're going to lead it and have a significant role, will probably be part of the bloodlines, even if it's distant, and or they're going to be, well, both ways. But if they were not part of the bloodlines, they're committed to the system, and they're going to be permitted to have their offspring intermarry into the bloodlines so that over the generations, their offspring is going to have a higher position in the world. So they like to control the parties, and every once in a while, you have somebody who comes along that sort of disrupts that whole thing. And then you can see the whole system rise up against them. I'm not sure we have anybody of recent history, I say that sort of tongue in cheek, where the whole system rose up against President Trump. But you can see the reaction of everything that is controlled by these families when they see that they don't have somebody who they want in power.
I'm actually surprised he got into office, because of all, I mean, those people did not want him there. He's not in those. Nobody that I know could find a society he was a link to.
Yep. Well, and you know, he comes out of the Democratic Party. I mean, he switched parties more on convenience. And so whatever his motivations are, I mean, and no matter how he acted, I mean, his policies for Christians and for freedom were good. And he was standing up against the powers of the world. I mean, the Europeans absolutely hated him. Not the average European. The European bloodlines absolutely hated him. The media absolutely hated him. The banks hated him. The oligarchical corporations hated him. The whole world rose up against him. And I think they're still stinging from how he got elected, and that if they had not created a scenario in this last election, he would have been reelected again. And when I say the scenario, I'm talking about all of the scenarios, like, you know, right from the media to the high tech to the covering of stories to the persecution to the elections, and, you know, everything. And they still, almost didn't get him elected, prevented him from being elected. And that's why you're never going to see a proper audit, an investigation that's objective on the election or any of the 5,000 sworn affidavits on the corruption. You're never going to see it. They will not permit it.
It's crazy because they tell us that it's an open book for the people, by the people. All it's not. It's not. And that is.
And if people want to know why the Supreme Court didn't take it, and they said beforehand they couldn't do it because there wasn't standing, because there's been no crimes been broken and it has to come up through the courts. And then after and during the election, they said, well, we have to wait till a certain date, which was when Biden was sworn in, and then we'll have a look at it. Then they said, we're not going to look at it at all. They're told not to look at it.
England said, I don't know if it was the prime minister. England said Trump was not allowed to visit their country or something like a couple years ago, right when he was elected.
Yep.
Did that still stand? I mean, could they really do that? Have another country say that? I mean, that's a diss to the office, not just to him, but to the office of president. Even if you don't like the president's there, you're supposed to respect the office of it as a representative of the country. So it was just very bizarre that they would say that. That publicly he's there, he's not, and he can't come. We don't want him in our country. That was intense. Yes. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanted people to see how what you put so much of your life into is affecting their lives. A lot of people might think, well, it's interesting, but it doesn't affect me, or that was a long time ago. And so it's important to see how this is affecting us all. Yeah,
and you get some tidbits through history. And there's a prime minister in Canada called Mackenzie King, and he was prime minister during World War II. And he wrote a lot of diaries and things, and they've kind of made these things sort of disappear. But he wrote that every time they had a high-level cabinet meeting and they were going to make decisions, there was an unnamed person who used to sit in. And they would decide what they're going to do. Then they would turn to this individual and he would say yes or no. The governments, you have to understand, the governments are doing what they're told to do and have a parameter that they can work in. But for the large decisions, they're going to basically have to ask permission. Can we do this or can we not do that? So if you're looking now at the Biden government and you're looking at him to challenge China or Russia or anything like that, unless he's given permission, he probably won't do it. I don't think Trump listened to them and he did what he wanted to do, for good or for bad. And I'll let people decide that on their own, but he seemed to be his own man.
I'm sorry, Gary. I had my mic still open when I was yelled at the dog. I'm so sorry. Somebody in the chat was, I guess they're new and maybe not familiar with the root of this conversation. I want Gary to explain that to you, but this is about the Genesis 6 verse, and he'll explain that verse and how that conspiracy that happened back then, how it affected the world in the past as well as now and probably in the future in regards to who these ruling elite are. So I will ask Mr. Gary to go back to the actual Genesis 6 conspiracy and give a rundown of it, if you don't mind, sir.
So again, the Genesis 6 conspiracy obviously begins in Genesis 6, and in the first 4 verses of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, you get this narrative that is part of the flood story. It's actually a preamble to the flood story. It sets the context to the flood story. And most people don't connect that, but there's nothing to separate the creation of these giants in Genesis 6, 1 through 4 from Noah's commission and then the flood story. So it's part of the flood story. And what happens is the sons of God, who are called the Watchers in some apocryphal books like Enoch and others, are angels who are the governing angels of the earth, reporting to Satan, because Satan is the god of this world. But in terms of their hierarchy, they are the watchers, they are the governors. They go to human females and they select wives and procreate with them and create offspring who are called giants in the King James Version Bible. and other English translations, it'll say Nephilim. These are the giant ones. This is the giant people, and they are the demigods of prehistory. And these demigods usurp the kingships around the world. And they control all of the government and all of the armies, and they control the religion, and it's a part of an organizational structure that we talked about previous, about the setting up the mystical religions by Enoch, son of Cain, and the Cainites are part of the partnership, and of course the fallen angels. And so they're setting up this organizational structure to parade the world into the first apocalypse by water, which is why you get the Genesis 6 story of the giants as a preamble to the flood. This organization and people crossed the flood. And I think by a second incursion by fallen angels, and those fallen angels would have gone to the abyss as well as 2 Peter and Jude talk about. And you have these giants and the religion that is passed on to them that is going to set up the same organizational structure after the flood. And this becomes the noble elite, the complete ruling class. So if you look around the world, you basically have a 4-class system. And in the West, we had kind of the feudal system. So it's the same setup all around the world. So you have the ruling class, the princes and the nobles and the cousins and the expanded sort of elite. And then you have the priest class who are running all of the religions. And then you have a small business merchant class, and then you have the serfdom class, or the ones who do all the labor, or the slaves. And it's the same setup all around the world, and only broken to a certain degree in the last couple hundred years in the West, but everywhere else it remains. So this is the system that has come down to the world. And the royals and the people who run the world, they keep these genealogies that go back to these fallen angels, a specific fallen angel and a specific offspring of the fallen angels, both before and after the flood, because they believe in their belief system that giants survived the flood, whereas I believe they were recreated again after the flood. Whatever way you believe, it ends up in sort of the same sort of direction, and they're the ones that are controlling the world today and are trying to bring about the end time so that they can have this rendezvous with destiny and have a war with God, because they believe that they can win and have their own realm away from God. So it's important to understand who they are and what they're doing, and what they're going to try and brainwash us with in preparation for this rebellion that people are going to be asked to participate in, and for the preparation to bring about the Antichrist and deceive people into following him and in place of Jesus. So hopefully, it was kind of a long answer, but I'm kind of hoping that
no, it was perfect.
And I encapsulated it for the person. So, yep.
I was actually starting to answer you, but now this time my mic was off. So talking at the wrong time tonight. So hopefully the gentleman in the chat room that gives you some background here, the fallen angels and their rebellion, mated with human beings, the daughters of men, as Genesis 6 says. Their offspring, their children became giants and were massive. We're not talking about just Goliath, but way, way, way bigger. We can talk about the size of some of them tonight. But now we're tracing our modern day elite, powerful, ruling, families that rule over finances, the financial institutions, you know, the banking systems, and world everything. Just have their hands in every pot. How it traces back to this event because they associate their ancestry with these very beings that are, like he explained, are rebellion to God. So hopefully you'll get that. That's the foundation of where we're going.
And a good example in terms of how it relates to America and the bloodlines, and we have to, and also understanding that when we see more of the visible ones today that are out in front, they're just, you know, working for as an avatar for the people pulling the strings in the background. So if you look at the Rockefellers or the Carnegies or the JP Morgans or any of the famous pseudo blue bloods in North America, they were sponsored by the Rothschilds and provided the money to be set up because they're the stable of agents for the European families that work in North America. And so in North America, everybody funnels through these bloodlines, and then they've been intermarrying with their offspring into the bloodlines as a reward for their servitude to the Rothschilds. And you know, they're very respectful and thankful because they actually put them into business. So the Rothschilds are part of the secret societies. They're not the ones that are part of the super elite, though. They were actually the Bauer family out of Germany. After a time after the Templars fell, the Royal Masons needed to reset up the banking arm outside of the church. And so they funded and sponsored the Bauer family in Germany to start setting up banking and to lend money and to lend money, you know, for wars and things like that. And they changed their name to the Rothschilds when they set up the London Bank. And so they've been intermarrying and ennobling themselves over the last 300 to 400 years.
So to sound less ethnic.
What's that?
They changed your last name to sound less ethnic, or
yeah, they wanted to distance themselves from a Germanic and a Jewish name, and they changed it to the Red Shield, which is an allegory for, you know, the mark of Cain in their belief systems. So,
wow, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that tonight, but I don't want to get you off too on that. Hold on, let me write that note. Viewers, I wanted to ask you, I just got a text here. We have two of our beloved brothers and sisters in the hospital tonight. I got a text from Nicholas. He said he's going to be out and he's feeling better, but he harmed himself at work. He's in Canada as well. And Stephanie, our beloved sister, is in the hospital right now. Please pray for both of them tonight and continue to pray for them in their recovery. We hate it when any part of the body is hurt. We're all affected, so we need to bear one another's burdens, thus fulfilling the law of Christ. But I wanted to, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here, but you were mentioning the Rothschilds, and somebody had asked about the Rockefellers, and the Avatar. That's what you were talking about there, because when you're talking, I'm making notes of what pops up to ask you on what you just discussed, and that was the Avatara. Now, would you explain what an avatar is to everyone? What that means?
Yeah, there's two concepts that they've been really working on and introducing to the West through movies, and the movie Avatar in particular. It's an ancient concept. It typically comes out of, in terms of that exact wording, out of the Hindu religion and Buddhism. And an avatar is a fallen angel or a god. The avatara is a human being. And so what an avatar does is it enters the body of the avatara. And there's a symbiotic relationship. It's similar to possession, but the host is asking for the fallen angel to do it. Usually the fallen angel will provide wisdom, strength, power, that sort of as a reward, versus a demon spirit that's not symbiotic. And the host hasn't asked it, and there's a war, asked for it, and there's a war going on. So, and Vishnu was the avatar for Buddha, just as Shiva had a number of avatars as well. Both of them had, have what they, and you'll hear this word over and over and over. They call this an incarnation.
Okay.
And so with the end time Antichrist, Lord Maitreya is one of the names out of the East, which is the new Buddha, and that he will be an avatara of either Satan or Azazel. I think it could be either, but I think Satan fits better because you have in Revelation 13 that all the power comes from Satan and gives Antichrist the power. So I think he's going to be the avatara. And we have an example in the Bible of Satan being an avatara, or an avatar for an avatara. In the time of Jesus, when Judas is looking to betray Jesus, he is struggling with this and he needs help. And that's when Satan enters into him and gives him that strength to get over the hump to betray Jesus. I think he actually, this is my speculation as well, I think there's another case in the Bible where Satan enters another being. In this case, I would say it was the serpent in Eden, the Nahash, because the Nakash, or the serpent, did not lose its legs, did not lose its speech, did not lose its arms, wasn't forced to crawl on the ground. Satan, none of that happened to Satan. It all happened to the serpent. And so if Satan deceived Eve, as a lot of people believe, or had sex with her, then he would have been the one that was punished. And Satan did not go to the abyss like the other impassioned fallen angels. So he wouldn't have been, the father of Cain, as a lot of people think as well. And I have a terrific 4-part series that walks through this in absolute detail. If you want to know why the story has trouble scripturally, that Satan is the father of Cain. I don't say that it's impossible, but
I don't see it.
The scripture doesn't seem to support that case. But I know there's a lot of people who will disagree with that. But if you want a blow by blow, detailed analysis of the serpent seed doctrine, just get a hold of me through my website. I'll send you that 4-part series, and I think you'll find it very, very informational. So that's the second time where I think Satan was an avatar. So we have to be careful with that, with those words that they're preparing us for, and that Antichrist will be an incarnation, just as Aslan in the Narnia tale is an incarnation. And Aslan, as he's called, is a Jesus-like person if Jesus went to another world. So an incarnation into a lion. Now, what's interesting about what Lewis did there was he took an Eastern concept, masked it as a Christian-like concept, and there's actually a lion demigod in Indian history, subcontinent of Indian history, called Narashima. And Narashima is this lion god, or demigod would be more accurate. And this was one of the incarnations of Shiva, who would be the equivalent to Azazel in the Judeo-Christian accounting of coming out of the book of Enoch in terms of naming Azazel as the destroyer god. And so you have to be careful with the propaganda and the language that they're preparing everybody for, to accept the great delusion that even the elect will be deceived in the end time, and how and why so many people will accept Antichrist as the true Messiah, reject Jesus, including people within the church, because he will have a resurrection. He will have a counterfeit Armageddon. They will counterfeit everything because that's what they've done right from the beginning with their angelic rebellion.
Yeah, absolutely. I will be like the Most High.
Yeah.
That's what he's always
Isaiah
wanted
14.
to do.
Yep.
I agree with you on the Cain issue. But you know, like how I say, if people disagree on something, but you can see it clearly in the scriptures, I got no problem with it. But what I see in the scriptures is that it's clear that she knew her husband and Cain was born, and that she had received him from the Lord. So I have an issue with that. It also takes literal things in Genesis and turns them allegorical, which I don't agree with on that. But you know, it's not foundational.
And as you go down in Genesis 4 there, the same language is used for the birth of Enoch, son of Cain. And then the same language is used for the birth of Seth. And a lot of people will say, well, Seth's lineage is in Genesis 5, and why, if they're of the same, parents, then why wouldn't they be together? Of course they're together. You have Seth being born in Genesis 4, and then you get the complete lineage in Genesis 5, but they like to ignore the inconvenient passages. So if the language, my point is, if the language is exactly the same for those three in Genesis 4, then you would have to say then that Cain, Enoch, son of Cain, and Seth were also offspring of Satan. But Christians don't tend to say that. The Gnostics say that, but not the Christians who believe in the serpent's seed. But the Gnostics do, because they believe the complete Cain line were all giants, and that Noah was a giant and his lineage was giants as well. So of course they're going to say that.
That's bizarre.
It is.
I didn't know that. I looked
but
at
what it does for them is it contaminates the Seth line and the descendants of Noah thereafter crossing the flood, right?
Yeah, I was recently researching just a taste of it when I was studying the book of Colossians on our Wednesday night Bible study over on CES. We were going over some of the refuting of the things that were being taught, the voluntary humility, worshiping of angels. So I went back to the first century Gnostics and found that they have some bizarre teachings. So that surprised me, but it didn't at the same time. But I've only touched base on that. I haven't gone deep into it. But that's a strange teaching, but I believe it. I believe they do.
They do. And also it was appropriate at the time that I look at those passages that you were referring to as they were referencing the Essenes, which were the third circle of the Judaic society, along with the Pharisees and the Sadducees from the religious perspective. And the Essenes would not give up the names of the angels they worshipped even upon death. And everything that they're talking about in that whole series of things are what the Essenes practiced. So I think Paul was talking about the Essenes.
Yes, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. There were the teachings of the Essenes mixed with Jewish philosophy of the Essenes and mixed with Gnosticism.
Yes.
There was all kinds of stuff I was researching there. It is fascinating. But when you said they didn't give up the angels they worship upon fear of upon death, threat of death, what do you mean by that?
They had names for the angels, and you'll note that in the Bible we don't get a lot of names of angels. We get two, and we don't even have Satan's name. Although I think Halel would be his name, as Isaiah 14:12 has Lucifer in the King James Version Bible, which is an Italian word for the Hebrew word Halel, and typically angels' names end in El, whether it's Azazel out of Enoch, or Michael, or Gabriel, or Uriel. That's in the Apocrypha of the Old King James Version Bible, or Raphael would be another one. So those are the only names that we get. So then
you got Enoch, Uriel.
Yeah.
You got Enoch angels all end in L also.
Yeah. So, and somebody might say, well, Semieza doesn't, but that's a corruption. I've got a document on that as well. That's actually Azazel. Yeah.
So you think it's the same person, and that one is actually
Yep.
a description or a title or something?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm writing that down
and if
because I'm on that.
yeah, and actually, Yaza is sort of a polytheist word for a fallen angel, and Shem is from the Hebrew word, is connected to Shem in the Bible, but there's a root word, which is the word for heaven, which is Shema, and Shem is the singular form, and the word Shemayim is the plural of Shema, as in I am with the plural, and that's the heavenly ones. So that when it's talking about the heavenly ones, you're going to see that term used in the original Hebrew. And so when you look at Shemiyaza, that's the singular form, and then you've got a Zen word, as it actually is believed in polytheism, that's sort of added on. But they were somehow separated through the corruptions of Enoch down the line. There's a few corruptions in Enoch. We don't have an original, complete Hebrew manuscript of Enoch. I think it runs 99% consistent with the Bible, but there's a few issues in there. And again, I have a document on some of those inconsistencies if people want it. And I'm not dismissing Enoch because I like it a lot.
Last time, me too. The first Enoch, of course.
First Enoch, yep.
Yeah, that's, well, it's quoted word for word. Is it in Jude? Jude quotes him, right? It's that book. And so I think there's truth to it. I think it's actually, there's truth to it. And the only reason I think it's important to actually read it and get acquainted with it is because I believe all the first century Jewish converts and even some of the Gentile converts would have known the story. They would have known and had Enoch in the back of their mind in the context of understanding these letters, like when Jude wrote these things and Peter wrote, taking vengeance on them. So I think they would have understood it correctly. And I can't find any reference, because I want to defend this because it constantly comes up. I can't find any reference to other teachings on Genesis 6 other than what the truth of it is. And nobody seemed to have a problem with it saying what it means and meaning what it says in the early church, right around the apostles' time. Everybody just accepted it as, yep, that's what happened. So, I mean, it was common knowledge. Even Josephus mentions having is it Amalekite that he had on display, 21-foot tall skeleton they had in the first century on display. So, and this was the Titans. These were the Greek and Roman gods. So everybody knew where these gods came from. They were half god, half human, and everybody was aware of it. But I can't find the teaching like today where they're claiming good believers and non-believers have these when we say genetic anomalies, that it does not even begin to touch it. This is why I mentioned this, because I want people to understand not just the strange manifestations most of them had, but some of them had really crazy things, like one eye and fangs and stuff, and double rows of teeth, 6 fingers, 6 toes. But these things were beyond massive. I want Gary to explain to us what the first incursion of giants has been reported to have been like, what they sounded like, how tall they were. Just get an idea of what these things were, because there was no teaching on Genesis 6 other than the truth up until the recent church sometime. And I'm sure Gary would know that when this teaching began about that it wasn't really the sons of God.
You've got a couple of church fathers that were struggling with the aspect of recognizing that the angels created these giants and that there was these things that were not quite human, and then they debated it and they struggled with that. But the majority of church fathers accepted that these were giants, and it was the standard teaching within Christianity up until a couple hundred years ago, when two things happened. When the Jesuits got control of the seminary teachings and universities of the Catholic Church, and outside the Catholic Church, the Gnostics took over control of the seminary schools in Christianity. So they got control of that information, and they started to teach the Sethite doctrine. At the time of Josephus, it was the standard doctrine all around the world about gods procreating with human females to create demigod, which is the ancient definition of a demigod, is the offspring of a god and a human female. And they were giants, and there were giants all around the world. It's the same story written about all over the world. So if you go into Greek mythology, Poseidon, mates with a human female, Clymene. He creates 10 Nephilim king offspring, which are also called heroes and titans, because they can be titans of the heavens and titans of the earth. And Atlas would be a classic case of being called both. That's the Atlantean Empire, which is why it's so popular in Western cultures, because that was the helm of world government and the golden age that was trying to take over the whole world. So that's why you have the reference to the New Age as also being the new Atlantis that they want to bring about. And so if we look at what these things looked like in their size, Josephus said that these bones that were on display were completely of a different kind and structure of a human, and that they just awed people in their size and the differences of that bone structure. And you would need it to support the size of these beings. They weren't 7 feet tall. They weren't 8 feet tall. They were much larger than that. And we don't get in the Bible an accounting of how tall they were. We do in Enoch, but it's sort of, we don't know what the dimension of an L is. So when we see 300 L's as it's translated in one of the translations of Enoch, in another one it's translated as cubits. A cubit would get them to be like 450 feet tall if you're using a common cubit versus a royal cubit of 21 inches. So I think they're a lot smaller than that. The general sort of conclusion with the information that we have is that they were thought to be 20 to 40 or 50 feet tall. Some people might say as tall as 100 feet. I think they're using the reference in the book of Amos, where they're the Amorites, which are hybrids. They weren't purebred Rephaim or Nephilim. They're hybrids. Were as tall as the cedars in Lebanon. Well, they grew to be about 100 feet tall and about 40 feet wide. But that's an allegory. It's a simile. So again, you have to be careful with that. But the general consensus is 20 to 40 feet tall. And these were the terrible ones, both before and after the flood, as talked about in Isaiah and Ezekiel. And in Isaiah 25, as I recall the passage, you have the strong ones. That goes back to the Hebrew word as, which means strong, as in stout, because they were thought to be twice as wide as the average human. So where a typical human would have a height to width ratio of 3 to 1, they had a 2 to 1 ratio, and that's where the stout word comes in. So they were extraordinarily wide. And we don't know, we don't have, unless you look at perhaps Gilgamesh, but I think he's created after the flood, and he's certainly not on the ark in the Epic of Gilgamesh as Upmatishan is, so he could be much bigger than Gilgamesh. But Gilgamesh is I think part of the second incursion, just as Enkidu is as well. And Gilgamesh is 11 cubits tall, so that's going to be 16 feet and some change using 18 inches, or because he was the king of Uruk, he would have been measured on a royal cubit, which would have taken him to about 19 feet tall. So the weight of these things that were thought to be, using Goliath, not Goliath, but Gilgamesh, they would have been like 3,000 pounds. I mean, these were monsters. And even in the time of after the flood with the Rephaim, which are seemingly from scriptural accounts the distinction of the post-Diluvian giants as opposed to the Nephilim of the antediluvian or before the flood giants. The Rephaim, you have an account with King Og, who's the last of the Rephaim, the last of the giants. The word giant goes back to the word Rapha. Rephaim is the male plural again. And just so that people don't get lost here, Nephilim is only used 3 times in the Bible for giant. That's once in Genesis 6:4, and then twice in the same verse in Numbers 13:33, and that's part of the bad report. And I'm not saying that that discounts all the giants, because the Anakim were actually Rephaim as they're described in Deuteronomy 2, where the word giant goes back to Rephaim. So the Nephilim are before the flood, Rephaim are after the flood. Og is the last of the giants, last of the Rephaim, and his bed is 9 cubits in terms of length. So that bed is going to be anywhere from 14 to 16 feet. But because he was a king, it would be a royal cubit, and a cubit, as provided to us by Josephus at that time, was 21 inches for the royalty. You get a few varying degrees of royal cubits, to an inch or two this way or that way, but generally 21 inches is the standard for the royal cubit. That means that Og would have been more like somewhere between 12 and 15 feet tall, depending on which cubit that you're going to use there. And the bed had to be an iron bed because his weight was too heavy because of his width, and total weight would have crushed a wooden bed. And then in the time of Goliath, we get his dimensions, and he's said to be 8 feet tall in churches. Well, that makes no sense, but that's because, again, they're trying to diminish it. He is 6 cubits and a span, and he is a Gittite from Gath. And what I mentioned earlier is that the Rephaim were the kings. So he's from the royal family, if not the king of Gath. And that's also why I think David took 5 stones, because the Philistine Pentapolis of kings were all there. That's 5 cities of the Philistines with their kings there, with their Rephaim rulers. And I think he was prepared to kill all 5 kings that day if he had to. But he only had to use one, and that started the rout against the Philistines that day. And so Goliath would have been anywhere from 9 feet 9 inches to 11 feet 3 inches. And because he's of royal bloodlines, I would expect he was more like the 11-foot mark. So that now is a daunting figure if you look at what science is telling us, whether it's totally accurate or not. I'll leave that up for everybody else. But the average person was 5 to 5.5 feet about that time. So Goliath would have been twice as tall and about 6 times the weight.
I got a question about the Goliath thing here. This is wonderful that you said that, because the reason they want to diminish the size of these giants is to say, see, it's just a genetic anomaly, like that
Yes.
Robert gentleman over in England that was that tall. Well, these weren't weaklings that had to hold themselves up on canes. They were, like you said, their bone structure, it was just, they were like twice as thick, weren't they? And they had thicker skulls and thicker everything. So,
well, you have these elongated skulls, right, that are way bigger than a human skull. And you can bind a child's skull and make it elongated, but you can't increase the cranial capacity. These were significantly bigger, and they don't have sutures. All human skulls have sutures. They're of a different species. And this was a look that would give them very high cheekbones and a sort of long, slender sort of jaw going down towards the chin. And they had large opening for eyes that were a bit wraparound. So if you wanted to look at what a diluted Rephaim would have looked like, Google Akhenaten of King Tut's time and look at one of his statues, and you're going to see this serpentine-like face. That's because the Watchers were the Seraphim angels that I talked about. Seraphim, I am plural, the serpent ones, as they're defined. They had faces of serpents, or still do. And when they took a physical body, that required a DNA to create that, to be able to have sex, and that was passed on. So you have the serpentine look being passed on to these giants. So they're horrible to look on. And their voices would, they describe it in Greek mythology as Atlas, bellowing from the bowels of Hades and vibrating the world. I mean, their fear, their sound of their voices, the look of their faces, their smell, they were the terrible ones to look at, and they did terrible things to the human race. So you have this serpentine imagery all around the world in prehistory, both before and after the flood. That's not a coincidence. That's because those were the governing angels. Those were the Watchers. And if people are saying, well, Watchers isn't in the Bible, yes, it is. It's in Daniel 4 3 times. And those angels are sent down from God as loyal seraphim angels. Not all seraphim rebelled. And they have instructions of kingship and rule, because that was part of the job of the seraphim, as well as the religious aspect, because the seraphim, as in Isaiah 6 talks about, were the fiery serpent ones who worked before the altar in the fiery stones, and they're actually take one of those stones out to take the sin away like a priest would for Isaiah, and they're working before the altar. That's the second part of what they're responsible for, which makes sense that the Watchers then would have that hierarchy set up of not only the priest class, but the warrior class and the ruling class, because two of those are what the Watchers were responsible for. And then it's the mighty angels, which would be in charge, and the archangels, the rebellious ones, which would be in charge of the warrior class. And so you have this imagery of ancient and prehistorical kings that have the serpent look, as they're described, and their gods are serpents. So you have that as a common look described all around the world, but there are other ones that you were talking about, like the Cyclops. But in the Bible, we also get the lion men of Moab, who were mighty warriors, and those lion men are another kind of Nephilim, and they're created by angels or gods in polytheism, like Nergal, who looked like a lion, or Mahat in Egypt. And they procreated as well and created lion-like Nephilim. And there are other ones as well, but those are the two that we can directly take back to the Bible. But you have the Anunnaki, who are shown in Sumerian inscriptions and things, and they have a bird-like face, just as Horus is a falcon or a bird or a raven. So it's part of their allegories. And you have beings that are called the Tengu in Southeast Asia.
They were in recent.
Yeah, and I have a document on the Tengu if people want that. And they look just like these Anunnaki gods. And you have the Xibalba in the Kishamaya, which were their giants. And the Xibalba were bird-like demigods as well. And what's really interesting as well is there's a branch of the Xibalba called the Camazotz, and that's the house of the bats. And if you Google...
I've never heard of that. You got to tell me some more. You got to talk some more on that. This one group, I've never heard that. The name, how'd you say it?
Xibalba. They're written about in the Popol Vuh, the holy book of the Kishamaya.
Okay, that's what I got.
Right?
You.
But the Camazotz, if you Google Camazotz, Camazotz, you're going to get this picture that comes up that looks like Batman's outfit. So
wow. Wow.
But of course, all the superheroes are, for the most part, based on the Nephilim, right? So that would make some sense. And so you've got all these sort of different kinds. And you also have to be aware of Anubis, And Nabhaz, as a god of the Avim, are described in the book of Kings, Second Kings, which was depicted as a dog or a jackal. Then that now brings in the dogmen, that if they procreated, and of course in polytheism they did, so you even had a whole city of Anubis's offspring of dog warriors, and these were mercenary warriors that were around and have many historical accounts through history, right up even till after the time of Jesus, of these dog warrior creatures. Again, I have a great document on the a 3-part series on the dogmen that looks at what the Bible has to talk about dogs. Is there a connection there? There's a few, but it sort of fits completely in with that whole concept of these different kinds of Nephilim. And what's interesting is the mercenary dogmen seem to be at the lowest level of the Nephilim sort of hierarchy. And what's interesting is you go back to Goliath again, and when he sees David, who's just this young boy coming at him, and he says, "What am I, a dog?" I think he's saying, "What do you think I am? Just some lowly dog Nephilim? No, I'm Raphaim. What are you doing?"
That's funny. You, I wanted to ask you about that. I want you to actually go into that a little more depth. I'm taking notes as you go, so I won't forget. But there, you were talking about David and Goliath, and I had read the possibility of this, and I want to ask you. I cannot remember if I asked you this before, so forgive me if I have. But there was, there's the story where David buried the skull of Goliath, but some people have surmised that possibly David buried Goliath's skull actually on Golgotha, the place of the skull, not because it just because it looked like the skull, the actual mountain, but because it fulfills, in a literal sense, you shall crush the head of the serpent, his seed, the prophecy in Genesis. So when he was crucified on Golgotha, if David buried the skull there, it would literally have been under his feet, and his crucifixion would have been literally crushing him. So I had never heard that before. Had you heard that?
I have heard that, and there's definitely, when you look at the Hebrew words, there's a connection in the words, but I've not, been able to make sort of an etymological connection based on the words, but they're definitely related. If David did bury Goliath's skull in Golgotha Hill, then he would have had to have done it later in life. So he would have had to have kept the skull or knew where it was, because Jerusalem wasn't taken until he was an adult and captured Jerusalem. So there's certainly a possibility, because it's within his lifetime, but I've got no research to be able to sort of say, here's the coincidences and did it happen? And is that why there's such a close association of the Hebrew words?
Well, I think one of the main problems people have with accepting this as literal, this really happened. I know it's out there. I know it's intense. It's supernatural. But they don't get, they think when Jesus said the angels aren't given marriage means that they can't. Well, the fallen ones did. All he's saying is that there's no need for marriage in heaven. But the point I'm making is they came, and you mentioned this earlier, these beings took on physical form. They had to have the physical body, and they took, like Jude talks about, left their habitation. That Orange explained that word too in Greek, but they can't understand how a spiritual entity could do something physical. We see them eating and sitting down and eating with God, Abraham, and in Sodom and Gomorrah, they wanted to rape the angels. So I mean, it's not. It's just. It's there in the scriptures if you're looking for it. But I think that's the big jump people have to get over, is that these things came in physical form.
And marriage isn't required in heaven. And you need to read the Luke version. It gives you a better description that after we're raised, we're going to be like angels, and there's no need for marriage in heaven. That's the realm of the spirit beings. But we get, as you mentioned, a lot of accounts scripturally of angels who take a physical form, all sorts of different physical forms throughout the Bible. They eat, they touch, they are in a physical body in those accounts in the Bible that you talked about. And
they fight with a sword.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what that tells us is they can create a physical body and interact with the world. So what's going on here is you take that back to Jude 1:6, where they left their habitation. You get that word habitation that goes back to the Greek word oiketerion. And oiketerion means a dwelling place for the spirit. So they left their heavenly dwelling place for their spirit in heaven, and they came to the earth. And on the earth, they're going to need a dwelling place for that spirit, which is the body and the soul. That's why we're told there's a spirit, body, and a soul. The soul and the body are of the physical world. The spirit is of the heavenly realm. And in 2 Corinthians 5, we get oiketerion used one more time as the house in heaven. And it's talking about, the clothes of heaven and the clothes of the earth. So there's two different types of dwelling places for the spirit, and one's required for heaven and one's required for the physical world. And that heavenly house, I think, is a word that is used because when Jesus talks, he says, I have many rooms in my mansion in heaven, right? That's the heavenly house. That's the spirit that is reserved, and the place and the dwelling place reserved for your spirit in heaven, because you believe in Jesus and in God and the Holy Spirit. And so you have to have a dwelling place for the spirit, and they have the ability to create this physical body for that dwelling place for the spirit. And that makes sense when you look at what happens with Jesus, is that this is not an incarnation that we talked about earlier. This is the Word made flesh. So the Holy Spirit comes upon Mary, and he creates the start of the growth of the soul and the body to house the Word who becomes flesh. That's the Spirit. And that is who Jesus is, and that there's no sex. There's as in polytheist accounts, there is just this dwelling place for Jesus to enter into, to interact in the world, to become physical, so that he can complete his commission and be crucified. And of course, if the angels had anticipated, as Corinthians talks about, the resurrection, they would have ensured he wasn't crucified. So they didn't know everything that God had in mind, because he's Alpha and Omega, and he's allowed everything to play out through free choice. And there's no way that angels, who are creation of God, can outsmart the omnipotent one. So he's Alpha, Omega, angels are not. And so you need a body to procreate. And that's why you have to have DNA to be able to procreate. And that's why the Nephilim would look similar to the physical form of the angel that he took in the physical world. And that would have been passed on through the mothers that they mated with. So this also all makes sense if you understand what's going on in terms of the language, and that to me, it was really sort of cracked open with understanding that word oiketerion, which is the dwelling place for the spirit. And it also makes sense for the bodiless spirits of the giants, which are the demons, that they want to interact in the world because they're like in dry places. And they're like thirsting, and they want a place of rest. And the only place they can interact in the world and get rest is by possessing a human and suppressing the human spirit. And that's why it's not a symbiotic relationship. And so they're always roaming, looking to inhabit a body, because they need a dwelling place for their spirit. And their spirit didn't die, wasn't permitted to sleep, and it wasn't permitted to go to heaven. So they roam the earth. And again, I have a great document on how we know the demons are the bodiless spirits of of the giants if people want to get a hold of me.
Yes, I was really surprised to hear a pastor recently not understand that, or at least not believe it, because I don't know why it's difficult. I think it's an easy concept to see. Why else would they be disembodied? That's part of the judgment. They were not supposed to be here. They're not on earth. They're not in heaven. There's nowhere for them to go yet until judgment. And so their temporary position is to just be floating around without a body. And that makes a lot of sense why they're seeking a home. You know, Jesus said you can't come out.
They are reprobate counterfeit spirits.
Yeah. So, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. Also, without understanding that this concept of the event that happened on Mount Hermon, you're going to miss, I think, a lot of details in the scripture, such as, because if people aren't familiar with the story in Enoch, that the angels fell at Mount Hermon. That's where they made the oath with one another that they would do this thing, that they would have children of their own and come in a physical form and mate with women and create children. And that is where Jesus is standing when Peter, he asked them, who do men say that I am? And he says, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Blessed are thou, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but Father in heaven. So he says, and on this rock, I'll build my church. And we know that, Jesus is the rock. Christ is that rock, as Paul says that Moses struck. It's a picture of living water coming out of the rock. And that's Jesus and the Holy Spirit. And we can see that picture clearly. But if you don't get what happened at Mount Hermon, when he says, and on this rock, I'll build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He's standing right there at a gate of, like almost a virtual gate, a portal to hell, the gates of hell, because that's what the enemies are. They came through that place, and the serpent, seed of the serpent, is kind of developed there. That's the beginning of them manifesting in these forms as giants. It's where it all starts. And I think that you don't understand the magnitude of the flood and why it was necessary. I think there's a lot of things we can miss if we don't understand Genesis 6. And I think it's really important. And I get bashed a lot by independent fundamental Baptists, and my local church is independent fundamental Baptist. So it's, my pastor believes it. He believes Genesis 6 is literal, like it says. And a few others do too that I've heard. I'm very happy. I think you and Steve Quayle and Marzulli, you have all really enlightened people into looking and seeking the scriptures on this issue. And I think it's a very, very, very strong case. I think the other view really, doesn't work, and you miss a lot of it. So I think it's important that we understand this concept. But I wanted to ask you. You go ahead and.
Well, I would add on to that you can't understand what happened before the flood unless you understand who the Nephilim were. You can't understand history after the flood, what was going on at Babel, what was going on in the time of Abraham, the war of giants in Genesis 14. You can't understand the Exodus. You can't understand how our history has been affected unless you understand who the giants are and who they were today. And if you're trying to understand prophecy, you have to understand prehistory, because so much of the allegory and the meaning and is based in prehistory. But prophecy, end time prophecy, is the resolution to those events that took place in prehistory, starting with the angelic rebellion, and then on, with other events like what happened in Eden, what happened in Genesis 6. It's the denouement to that whole rebellion and the second revenge to try and ensure humankind would not be raised up to be like angels in the future time. It was designed to justify their rebellion, because if they could have the ones who chose God by choice before given immortality, unlike the fallen angels, then they believed they could win their own realm. They knew they couldn't defeat God. They were always trying to have a realm on their own, so Satan could be like God, but away from God and God's oversight. And that's what they're going to try and deceive humans in the end time to try and fight for, is to have that realm. And they're going to try and convince humans you can fight against the evil God of the Bible. But if you don't understand what was going on with the Rephaim nations, and what Israel was doing in the Exodus and the conquest of the covenant land, you miss the whole story of what's going on there. And then you're more easily susceptible to deception, that saying, hey, that is the evil God. That's the same God who caused the flood. That's the same God who had all of these innocent people butchered in the land of the covenant. You see how they plant those seeds and then build on it. Once they get that wedge door open, they can kick it wide open with a whole bunch of other things. And the whole thing is, right from the creation of the mystical religions, is to lead people away from God. Right? And to not give God credit for anything, to degrade God, and to honor their pantheon of gods. And that comes through in the sciences, which come out of the 7 sacred sciences, which created the mystical religions of Enoch.
You know, he's made himself look like he's the advocate for humanity. Like, I wanted you guys to have knowledge. I was on your side.
Yeah.
And so, and God's an evil God, like Blavatsky wrote, and had it all backwards. And you're right. There's just a little, all you have to do. And I can't tell you how many unbelievers have said this, that God's a tyrant. He's a kid with an ant farm that likes to just play with people's lives and just indiscriminately kills people. And look, he was a mass murderer, a genocidal maniac in the Old Testament. And that's exactly what it looks like if you don't know what's going on there.
Yeah.
You know?
And you won't understand why we're warned in the New Testament that Satan masquerades as an angel of light.
Or it's right. Or why Saul, the spirit left Saul because he wouldn't kill someone.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a shocker
well,
for people
and
understand it.
If you didn't understand that Agag is the king that Saul was told to kill, had a patronymic title that was passed down through the ages for the Amalekite hybrid nation that came from Timnah, a Horim, and Eliphaz, son of Esau, and that Timnah, as being a Horim, is Rephaim. It's a branch of the Rephaim. That this was a nation that was trying to wipe Israel from the face of the earth, which is why they attacked them as soon as Israel left Egypt, when they weren't ready. They had no weapons. They had no ability to make weapons. They were a ragtag collection of slaves that the Amalekites attacked them at that time to wipe them from the face of the earth. Why? So that they could inherit the birthright that Jacob received, that they could inherit the blessings that Jacob received, that they could inherit the promise of the Messiah to bring about their dragon Messiah and inherit the land of the covenant by wiping Israel from the face of the earth. And in Numbers, you also get another king, Agag, there, who is having his kingdom and his power compared to the coming Messiah kingdom. That's how powerful these Amalekites were. They were one of the powerhouses of the ancient world who attacked Israel when they were fleeing from Egypt. I mean, and it was so poorly looked upon that even though they didn't destroy the Amalekites at the time of the conquest, it was put down that once you have a monarchy, that is what you're supposed to do. And when King Saul swore the oath of taking the kingship, that went with all of the warrior aspects and military covenants that were part of the kingship. and was also told to complete what was commanded by God at the time of the Exodus to attack the Amalekites and wipe them from the face of the earth. He refused to do it. I mean, he attacked them, but he didn't go all the way. David took care of the job, but still some Amalekites still survived. So when you get down in the time of Esther, with the Amalekites, again, they're trying to wipe the remnant of Judah from the face of the earth with Hamath, the Agagite. Agagite goes back to that patronymic term. And this is not just somebody who is a mystery person. This is a renowned king of the bloodline who is set above all the other princes of the vassal conquered states of Persia, second only to the king of Persia, who was trying to wipe Judah from the face of the earth. And if he didn't have this ennobled bloodline, this long descendant who calls himself an Agagite would not have had that prestigious position because he had no country. That's how ennobled that bloodline was.
I am so glad you said that. I have so many, and I did not research it enough. I'm telling you, this is one of those things where you just know something and you don't know why you know it. But I said I know that this, I think was his name Haman, right? Who was the one that was trying to kill the Jews in Esther? Was it Haman?
Hamath.
Oh, I even said I think it goes back to that king. And if he was done what he was supposed to do, then they wouldn't in peril again because God saw the end from the beginning. And so you just put them together, and that's exactly what my gut was on that. I really do believe that. And I think it repeats over and over again. Like we'll keep seeing these Antichrist figures come up to destroy over and over again.
Yeah. Now, in that marriage of Timnah and Eliphaz that produces Amalek, which is going to produce the hybrid nations, and understand the Amalekim are another Rephaim race. Those are the Amalekim of Genesis 14, which predates Genesis 36, right? So they're accepting that name as sort of a patronymic name for Amalek, for this new hybrid race. This is part of the Dukes of Edom, right? Where you have the Horim and the Hivim, who are rulers of Edom before Esau gets there. But the descendants of Esau intermarry with these Dukes of Edom to create the Dukes of Edom from his descendants and the Dukes of Edom from the Horim and the Hivim. Duke goes back to the Hebrew word Aleph. And Aleph is the word that the Gnostics like to use for elf. And these are the elf kingdoms, or the Aleph kingdoms, as they're also called in Gnosticism, which are the fairy kingdoms, which are the Tuatha De Danann are going to branch out of, that are going to go up the Danube River and into Norway and Sweden and Russia. And another branch of the red-haired ones are going to go over to Ireland. These are the fairy kingdoms. And this is the branch that Prince Charles that we were talking about was talking about as having genealogies back to Vlad the Impaler, who takes his bloodlines back to Scythia, which was the Tuatha De Danann.
And I didn't realize the fairy thing went, you could trace it that far back. Like yep. I knew it was a branch that came out, and with the Tuatha De Danann. It's fascinating what you've done in your book, and I bet you could have done an entire book just on that.
Oh yeah, it's endless information on it. Yeah.
But I wanted, you said, if they don't understand this particular concept and miss a lot, you said, or what happened at Babel. They won't understand what happened at Babel. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, because Babel is not only is it an archetype for the end time, where you have an Antichrist type figure controlling humanity, is you have the restart up of the Babel religion. And so this is where that religion, that Enochian mysticism, crosses the flood. And it's either introduced to Nimrod by the giants, or as the Gnostics and the Freemasons in their history of Freemasonry, their accounting is that a fellow by the name of Hermes finds the two pillars of Lamech of the Cain line, or the two pillars of Enoch. They've got a couple different versions on it, and find the directions to the hidden knowledge under the pyramids that has 36,525 books of all of the knowledge of Enoch and the antediluvian world and of the religion, and takes it back to Babel, where he meets up with Nimrod, and that's the religion that he sets up at Babel, which is the allegory for end time Babylon. And Nimrod is quite an interesting character as he's described in the Bible, because he is said to become a mighty one. Mighty one goes back to the Hebrew word gibor, and giborim is the male plural. That is the same word that is used to describe the Nephilim in Genesis 6:4, the mighty ones of old, the men of renown. The men of renown, and renown there goes back to the Hebrew word Shem and Shemayim, and the heavenly ones. So you can almost read that two different ways. That not only they were infamous, but they were of the heavenly ones. But the Gibborim, he becomes a Gibborim somehow. But we know he's the son of Cush, so we know he's not born a Nephilim. But the Septuagint, which I don't put all total faith in, because it's got a lot of corruptions in it, but its accounting of Nimrod says that he made his reputation on the giants, and so through that reputation of being a hunter and a warrior, he succeeds to becoming the king of all the Noahites after very shortly after the flood, within 100 years after the flood, and while they're still all together. And he sets up a Nephilim or Rephaim type civilization. And we also know that the Rephaim are there immediately after the flood from those accounts. And then after Babel, Nimrod actually marries into the Anunnaki or the Rephaim bloodlines as we would know them scripturally, and starts the Mesopotamian dynasties thereafter. And he's accounted for in Sumerian tradition as Enmerakar, who also built in its accountings in Sumerian history, also built a Babel-like tower, and people who were dispersed and the languages were confused, and it's a polytheist accounting. But that starts these hybrid bloodlines that are intermixing with the Rephaim bloodlines, just as you have that same type of bloodline that is coming out of Timnah and Eliphaz to create Amalek, another hybrid human bloodline. And another thing that, while I'm talking on this, is that if you want to understand, not get confused about the giant nations after the flood, you have to understand that there's hybrid nations and there's the Rephaim nations. So all of the patriarchless Canaanites in Genesis 10, whether it's the Amorites or the Jebusites or the Hivites, these are all hybrids. And the reason why they don't have a patriarch listed there is because it was a Rephaim patriarch. And then the Canaan, we have a human patriarch for Canaan, and Canaan is also the father of Sidon and Heth. And then what happens with Canaan, Seth, and Sidon, Heth and Sidon, is they're going to have some of their daughters intermarry with these Rephaim as well, and they're going to create hybrid Canaanites, Sidonites, and Hittites. And so a lot of people confuse Amorites and Hittites as being part of the giants. They are, but they're like the Shazu that are described in other Middle East accounts, who were 7 to 9 feet tall, versus the Rephaim, which were 10 to 18 feet, 19 feet tall, with, if you consider that that was the height that was provided for Gilgamesh. So they were giant-like, much taller than the Israelites, but they're the hybrids. So when you get that accounting that I talked about earlier in Numbers 13, and you have the embellished story that the Anakim are Nephilim, as giants goes back to, that is designed to scare the people. But when you go back to the details of the report before that, you have the Anakim kings of Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, who are living in Hebron. And those are kings of Kiriath Arba, or Hebron, with Arba being the patriarch for the Anakim. The Anakim in Deuteronomy 2 goes back to giants, which is Rapha, so they're the Rephaim. They're not Nephilim. But they were trying to scare the Israelites because the Nephilim were way bigger, as we talked about earlier in the show, than the Rephaim. But the Rephaim were still way bigger than the Israelites. But where I'm going with this is you also have the Amorites talked about, and the Amalekites, and you also have the Canaanites that are all talked about in that report, who are taller than the Israelites, but not the Anakim, but who lived amongst the Anakim in those mighty fortresses in the land of Canaan. So when you get into Deuteronomy 1, you get a restating of those legitimate facts, but not called as Nephilim. They're just called Anakim. Then you go into Deuteronomy 2 and you get the explanation of who these giant nations are before they're starting the conquest of the land. So if you're reading in Deuteronomy, you're getting all this information before they start the conquest. So in Deuteronomy 2, you get told about the Anakim, the Horim, the Avim, the Zamzuzim, and all these other nations of giants that they're going to meet up with as they're going to try and conquer the land of the covenant. So if you're going to understand like the geopolitical scenario and the peoples, you need to understand that there's two types of giants. There's the hybrid human giants, and then there's the purebred giants, which are the various Rephaim nations. Hopefully I didn't lose anybody there.
No. You did not. That was me again with my mouse. I didn't click on my mic. I try to turn it off so that I don't, if the dog barks or something, we don't miss something you're saying. It's important. Yeah. But I have so many questions, but I'm sad because we're not going to see you for a few months. You're leaving us for a while. But the guys in the chat, it's already been going, almost 2 hours, and they got questions. So yep. I want to make sure I get to them. And I am just blown away. I read your book, and I get more questions every time I read it. So in addition to when you're talking, you say things that aren't in the book, and that makes me think. So this could, I could just to steal your time forever trying to get all these things answered. But you guys, I'm going to ask this first viewer question because someone sent it personally to me. But post your questions now in all caps in the chat room. Please put them in all caps. The chat room is moving very fast. We have about 100 people at a time in the chat, and it's just rolling. I can't even see the questions. So put them in caps, and we will ask Mr. Gary. The first thing that I wanted to ask is somebody mentioned the Rockefellers and said something about them buying Jerusalem, buying land or buying Jerusalem in Israel. What are they talking about? Anything about that?
I don't have anything that I can confirm on that. I think that if you understand that there's a lot of bloodline money that is going into Israel, and that Jerusalem is going to be one of the key focal points of this new age that they want to bring about. In fact, Antichrist is going to crown himself King of Jerusalem in Jerusalem and reign from there. That they're going to want to own as much of Jerusalem as possible.
I see.
Right now, there's also going to be another war there in terms of before Armageddon, and Antichrist is going to take credit for that war. That's the Armageddon war. So Jerusalem is going to survive, and they know that, and he's going to take credit for it. Actually, in the Bible, in the Magog War, Joel 1 and 2, and Revelation 9, God stands up and fights for Israel. So whatever part Antichrist has or doesn't have in it, he's going to take credit for it, and then move his armies in to surround Jerusalem. And at that point, as the Luke account comes of that timetable of the end time, that's when he takes his armies in there and has himself crowned as the king of Jerusalem. So as we move closer, it makes sense that the bloodline families are going to want to have land and homes, probably, that they want to be living in Jerusalem. So it makes sense to me that they're buying it up. And they're going to ensure that there's a covenant that comes about that's going to protect Israel, which starts the last 7 years, which is Daniel 9:27.
Wow. So you've just heard rumor. Now, once again, he's not confirming or denying it, but just making some common sense, assessment, it sounds like. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that a little bit. So not all of Judah that we see today that's visible is the remnant. And there's a lot of satanic influences in there. There's Kabbalism, there's different peoples, but there's a remnant that's still there. And so when we look at the creation of Israel, you see that dark side of the satanic side that was wanting to bring about the nation state of Israel, because they want to bring about the end time. And all of that is likely true, but we can't forget that there's a remnant that's still amongst visible Judah that is going to be the ones that God is going to stand up and fight for. And those are the ones that are going to flee from Jerusalem and Israel at the time of the abomination, and God is going to protect them.
Now, wait a minute. The Rockefellers, did they change their name also, like the Rothschilds?
No, not that I'm aware of.
No.
They were just funded to get control of the banking and industry as part of the stable of agents that they had selected. So they would have had some sort of loose bloodlines or distant bloodlines to have been selected for that, and have been ennobling ever since.
Okay. That makes sense. Christine said, hi, sister. She said, has Gary considered writing about how these myths are manifested in modern culture?
Yeah, I've considered that. I've got a lot of other books in mind before that, though. I've got 2 books on the go. I've set one aside. And I've decided to, on my next book that I'm trying to work every day on and get it out, it's going to be, as much information that's on giants in the Genesis 6 conspiracy. And I said I would never write a sequel to the Genesis 6. I'm writing a sequel to the Genesis 6 because there's so much more information on the giants, and it's going to be more biblically centered. Like, I won't be going much into secret societies and things like that, but it's all going to be about the giants of the Bible, because there's so much information there. And I'm going to cover off the different kinds of giants, and I'm going to cover off the Nephilim, or not the Nephilim, but the Rephaim wars of the conquest, and I'm going to connect that back into a little bit of end time prophecy. So I'll have some in there about the Agagite bloodlines and how that connects into the Elf kingdoms, the fairy kingdoms, and stuff like that. So
you have to, because every time I talk to you, you'll say to the congregation, you'll say, if you want more information on it, I have a document. I have 36 pages. I have this. Cut several hundred pages off. You have to do a follow-up. You have to do. There's so much information. And I was thinking, if you did start yet another one, if you're so thorough, it would be like this big. It would take you a while. You'd have to cut it out,
Yeah. I'm going to have to. I don't want it as big as the last book, but it's not going to be 100 pages. It's going to be 300 or 400 pages for sure.
Yeah, whenever I talk about you, I say he wrote the literal book on this. Like literally, he's got so much information. It would not believe all the work you've done. Let's see. This question is, Gary, what do you think of David Barton and his book regarding Freemasonry?
Not familiar with his book, so hard for me to comment.
Yeah, and I don't know the context of the book to be able to even touch on the subject. I scrolled past the one question I was going to get there. Okay. Do you think the Antichrist will be a Freemason?
Not a Freemason. That's too low on the hierarchy. Royal Mason, absolutely. So typically,
Royal Mason is
a Royal Mason. That's at the
okay.
that's at. So if you go above the Rosicrucians, that's when you're getting into the Royal Mason orders, and those all come from the families. So they're going to be Masonic, but and when you talk about Masonry versus Freemasonry, Freemasonry was created starting with the Sinclairs, who were Royal Masons, and the St. Clairs. And so before that, you have the ancient Royal Masonry that was only held in members of the royal families, right? And so if you go back to the creation of the Knights Templar, you have the Anjou, you have the Lorraine, you have the Champagne and the Montefers, and all of these bloodlines from the kings of France that are creating the Knights Templar. That's sort of the modern creation of secret societies, is that Templar organization that was formed by the Royal Masons that goes back into prehistory, because the Masonic orders were all of the elite of the bloodlines right from the beginning.
Oh, Ben, that is a fantastic question. I'm gonna hold on to that for 1 second. I had Mia's question first, but I just saw your question. That is an awesome question that everybody wants to hear the answer to this. I've scrolled up some. Mia asked her, this is really cool. Mia, she's asking about the Marine Kingdom. Let me see, it disappeared. What happened? She retracted it. Why did you retract it? I was asking your question, Mia. She was asking about the Marine Kingdoms. You know, I guess she's talking about like mermaids and mermen. But I don't know the context of. Mia, put it back. Why did you take it down? Do you have anything on that?
Well, I mean, there's two aspects to this, and as it comes out. So you've got the Oannes, which are these gods that come out of the oceans. And they start the Sumerian civilization. So then that sort of indicates that there might have been some undersea civilizations. I haven't really been able to find anything on that to substantiate that. But if you look at some of the twists on the Atlantean mythology, with the city sinking into the ocean, and then some of those current Atlantean type of movies that have been out and showing the bloodlines and things like that, that's just an allegory for one set of bloodlines. So I'm not convinced that there's an undersea civilization, but who knows? I mean, there's always a possibility that there's something in the earth or something under the sea that has been kept from us. Certainly, we have the alien phenomena that has spaceships that are coming out of the sea. So there are either portals down there, or maybe them as survivors, as either from the flood, or survivors as being recreated as Nephilim beings in the second incursion after the flood. That's where they went with their technology and their knowledge, and just waiting to come out in the end time. But it's like so many different branches to that, all of what I just sort of talked about there, that it's almost sort of endless in the possibilities, but we just don't have solid verifiable information to substantiate that. So I kind of look at the marine ones as being an allegory for Atlantis. Now, if we're talking about mermaids, that's a whole different sort of kettle of fish. So mermaids are, again, some sort of Nephilim kind of creation, but typically they're just females. And you have a connection between the mermaids and what is talked about in the book of Enoch with the women who are the mothers who created the giants, as there's a strong connection there on the mermaids. But so I'm not sure what the question was actually directed
Yeah.
at. Yeah.
I'm hoping she reposts it. I'm not sure what the context. It was taken down before I could finish reading the end of it. But somebody asked, I guess this is just because we were talking about the Rockefellers. Do you know anything about the new statue at the Rockefeller Center, and what is that, if you know about it?
I'm not familiar with that. No.
I'm not either. Let me see. I'm sorry, we don't know about that, Sister Lori. Let's see. The question that I think every person, some people might think this aspect's interesting, or like the Marine Kingdom's interesting, or the fairy bloodline's interesting, but this everybody will affect. And that Ben's question is, what has Satan told those in league with him to convince them that he will win in the end?
It's a really good question. So I already said earlier that the fallen angels know they can't actually defeat God, but yet they're telling people that they can win. So that's why the polytheist religion is so important. That's why we need to understand Babylon and Babel and the Enochian mysticism that it's all based in and where it came about. And the modern version, as we would know it, would be Gnosticism today, that produced Theosophy, that also produced the New Age. So they're all interconnected. In that religion, in terms of what they believe, because it's many gods, polytheism, and there's a pantheon of gods and a hierarchy of those gods that Satan is at the top of, is that they teach in that religion, and they teach in the secret societies, that God is just one of those angels, that Satan is the equal to God. So that God is a powerful angel, but just an angel. And in Gnosticism, you have Sophia, who creates the 7 main angels, which they called the Mirage or El Debaoth. And that's who they classify as the God of the Bible. And this angel went rogue and became arrogant and said, there is none like me, but he's just one against many powerful ones that are equally powerful as he is, and Satan being one of them. And so the religion is about dualism, where you've got good versus evil that's in this perpetual battle that is never won. And so this is going to be a battle that goes on between the evil God of the Bible and the equal powerful Satan and his pantheon of gods forever. And that's why they say that you can win a realm free of God. And that's the deception that they're going to be laying out there, even though you can't defeat it. And so I'm trying to think of the movie that was sort of portraying that. That doesn't matter. It would just be sort of to flesh out some of that doctrine that they're just trying to win Earth as that realm that they can be separate from the God of the Bible. And again, Bible clearly says is that Satan is the prince and the god of this world, and that will be until the end time and Jesus comes back. So they already know the angels already know that after the resurrection that their fate is sealed, and that's why Jesus went in 1 Peter to the abyss to talk to those spirits of those impassioned angels, saying that your fate is done. You are going to the lake of fire. So all they can do now is deceive as many humans as possible and lead them away from God.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Defeated foe for sure. Somebody wrote, Lori, thank you. the statue that was asked about is some kind of ancient god, but I don't know which. I'm not surprised because we got Shiva out front of CERN, don't we?
Yeah. Well, again, they put everything out in plain sight in terms of what they believe. So it's going to be one of the major gods. It probably isn't Satan, but it's going to be a god that would be maybe Satan-like. It could be Zeus, or it could be Osiris, or it could be any one of those, because all the different pantheons around the world are the same gods. They just have different vernacular names.
Okay, she reposted it. She says she lost confidence in asking. Oh, no, darling. There's never any wrong question except the one you don't know the answer to. So we've got to get the answers for you. Let's see. Is the mermaid and marine kingdom Nephilim or fallen angels? So, okay. So you want to know if the mermaids, the marine kingdom. Well, I think he was just explaining that the mermaids are some kind of hybrid thing.
Yep.
Right? Would you think that from? Yeah,
Yep.
and so they are the offspring of fallen angels, either manipulating genetic or mating with something to create them. Because Enoch, doesn't it say they sinned against beasts and insects and everything? Like they just made a mess of the genetics of God's creation, and that's another thing about flooding it.
Yeah, they corrupted the whole world, and that's the Hebrew word shakath, which means destroyed, decayed, ruined, and a whole bunch of other words that mean the same thing. So when it says the whole world was corrupted, that means the DNA and the plant genome. The whole world was corrupted, except for the animals that God selected to be called to go on the ark to represent those species.
So when you hear these things like that, I'm so glad you explained that and that word's there, because I agree with you, Gary, on that. Noah was perfect in his genes, his generations. Nobody's perfect in their behavior. Plus, it's imputed righteousness by faith, like every saint has. So, I agree that but they try to say it's something different, it's something spiritual, but I think it's literal too. And all flesh, did it say corrupted itself upon the earth? Like everything was, and it was just evil continually in their thoughts too.
Yep. Yeah, similar to what's going on today.
Yes. Look, yeah, and where it has been will be again. You're right about that.
As in the days of Noah.
Oh yeah. Yes. And that's another thing. What you're not going to know what that means, really. I mean, not the same.
Not the full context. Yes.
That's right. Right. You get some of it, but let me see. Let's look. I just saw one. Something about a chimera. Where to go? Oh yes, mermaids are chimera. Sorry, I'm having to scroll through a lot of them here. Just saw. Here. Let's see. Pale Rider asks how the elite can believe that Jesus survived the cross, yet believe in the spear of destiny that pierced Jesus's side. How do they think he could survive that?
Well, what they believe is that Joseph of Arimathea took and got permission to get Jesus down from the cross before he died, then nursed him back to health. That's their story. And then afterwards, he met up with Mary Magdalene and then had children that his bloodline went down through one of the sons named Josephus, that it becomes part of the Grail bloodline and is taken to Glastonbury, and then that and intermarries then with the Avalon kings that the King Arthur stories are based on, which are the fairy kingdoms and the Tuatha De Danann. So that bloodline marries into the Tuatha De Danann kings in Wales. And then it also branches off with Aragon, with marrying Amenabad of the Merovingian bloodline. So they've got apparently these documents and evidence that they're going to bring out in the end time to prove this, and it's all designed to lead people away from God and not to believe in Jesus in preparation to accept the Antichrist. So they have to have that. It's false, but they've been planning this for millennia. So they're going to bring out ancient documents. So you're going to have to rely on your faith in the Bible, because they're going to hit us with propaganda and a campaign of lies and deceptions unlike anything we've ever seen before.
Yeah, and if you don't have eyes to see, you're not going to see it, because it's going to look like he comes as an angel of light. It's going to look righteous. It's going to look right. And, so you guys catch that. It seems that the Holy Grail to them is an allegory for this elite bloodline of Jesus Christ. That they believe he had children, and so the bloodline is the Grail. It's like the chosen or something.
So the Templars, which are the modern wedge of the Royal Masons and secret societies, was founded as the Grail keepers of the message. And Anjou, de Bouillon, and Lorraine were descendants of Dagobert, the last survivor of the Merovingians. And that's the bloodline that produced the Plantagenets, which King Richard and Prince John were, which of course the presidents take their bloodlines back into, and is intermarried throughout many of the royal bloodlines. And the Anjou have a dual title of the King of Jerusalem title that they carry with them down their bloodline, as well as you have a King of Jerusalem title with the Bourbon family, who received that title from the Habsburg Lorraine, which was received from the Lorraine through intermarriage of the Lorraine region of France and the Lorraine family. That's the same family as the Lorraine of the Knights Templar and a descendant of Dagobert.
Wow. Okay. We got another one. Sorry, Gary, I'm trying to get to it. JXJ asked, what do you know about the Jesuits and gematria? And you tell them what gematria is for people that don't know.
Well, gematria is a number of things. So typically, how we would understand it, it is the occult sciences that works with portals and numeral mysticism. So in this case, you have the Jesuits, who are the new Templars inside the Roman Church, as they were created to replace the Templars after the Templars fell. And the Jesuits were a group that were formed by Ignatius of Loyola, sponsored by the Grand Master of, I'm trying to remember the name of the society. It's slipping my mind right now. But anyways, he's a Borgia of the black nobility of Italy, part of the bloodlines and part of the Pope line. And Montesa order is what he was Grand Master of. And he actually becomes the third, after sponsoring Ignatius, he becomes the third leader of the Jesuits in about 1570, as I recall, on the dating when he takes over. And the Jesuits' belief system is the seven sacred sciences, which is the base knowledge that was split into those disciplines by Enoch, son of Cain, and created the mystical religion. And they interpret the Bible through the seven sacred sciences. And so when we get into that aspect, that's where you're going to get all of these offshoots of those seven sacred sciences, and gematria would be one of that. And in the Gnostic belief system, they believe that everything is to do with numbers and codes and things like that. So they would look at the world as being a matrix, hence the Matrix movies, that it's a projection and not a complete reality. And that's all based on encrypted knowledge and numbers and things like that. And so they're very, very much into that matrix system, and that at the end of sort of the rainbow of that gematria is the Atma particle that they're trying to search for, which is one of the agendas for CERN, which is the access to all knowledge. And it's an invisible particle that merges with other particles that then uses quantum entanglement to send all the knowledge instantly around the universe to create this matrix. And they're trying to tap into that knowledge. So this gematria subject is a very, very large subject. And I know I covered it quite quickly, but that's typically what gematria is. It has also a few smaller sideline things like divining and things like that. But the main thrust from the occult societies is the matrix sort of idea that the sciences are being developed to capture this access to this knowledge of the universe to go along with the beast system that is going to provide knowledge to be like God, and at the same time provide technology, clone bodies, replacement parts, you name it, to give you immortality, which are those two pieces to godhood in the physical world. And that's what they're going to offer through the Antichrist and the Mark of the Beast.
Do you remember what, about 15, 20 years ago, the Bible codes was a big deal? Remember, everybody was going around with that. That stems from Kabbalah, doesn't it? Or at least.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
That's Kabbalah.
I thought it didn't feel right to me. Like, because God is, I mean, it is, he does say, you know, it's a glory of God to hide a matter and a glory of kings to seek it out, but not in mystic and occult ways.
Right.
So
exactly.
That didn't, it felt a little too occulty for me, a little too Kabbalah. Now, Akeem asked if, oh, this is interesting. I never heard this before. Was Nimrod's wife a Nephilim hybrid?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think, as I said earlier, that he intermarried with the Rephaim nations after Babel. So, yeah, that would stand in perfect sort of consistency to how the Gnostics and the occultists look at Nimrod and how he became a Gibberim, and he produced a hybrid bloodline through that intermarriage and produced some of the, you know, the dynasties of Shinar or Sumer. So, you know, one of the cities that he begets is Erech, which is Uruk, which is the same city that Gilgamesh comes from a few generations later. So I think he was married right into that group of giants out of Mesopotamia.
Yeah, that would make sense. I mean, and she's worshipped, you know, as the goddess.
Yep.
And
well,
amen.
Well,
Maya just put the gospel in the chat.
Yeah, and people should understand that what the kings and queens did is they took on the persona of the gods as their divine representatives. So they would take on a god's name as being their divine representative.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you, Maya. She put the 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4. That was very, very nice. In case there's, you know, visitors that don't know the gospel, it's good to have it plain. Paul said it's the one that he preached, wherein we stand, the one that saved us. So that's very good. Someone also added that the statue, this is interesting, the statue they were referencing is actually a black version of Prometheus, tied to the Black Lives Matter agenda. That's what the statue was.
Oh, it's an interesting mix. And Prometheus, you know, Prometheus is a god. He's not represented as one of the higher gods, but Prometheus is more of an allegory for Satan because he provides fire to humans and knowledge to humans, and that's what Satan does. Yeah. So it's more of an allegory.
That's what I thought too. I was thinking he's the light bringer, the light, and they see him as giving us something forbidden, and then he got in trouble with the gods, punished him, and you know, he once again, it's Satan is the good guy.
Yes.
You know, they were asking earlier, and you were explaining, you know, Blavatsky and Theosophy, they all flip it. They all say God's the bad one, and the God of the Bible is the evil God, and Satan's the good one. And that's why it's clear in Scripture that he comes as an angel of light, and his ministers as ministers of righteousness. They're always going to, Satan's not going to come and start a religion with overt evil and things that we know God has called evil. He's going to just, it's going to be wonderful, and it's going to be good things to do, things we should do, except he's going to tell you to follow that and do that and trust him works and for your salvation.
And one of the things that I think Christians also get confused on, and they don't understand, and it's important to understand this, is that what people are taught in the occult religions is that they're the children of light. They're the good ones, right? So they don't think that they're doing evil. They think that they're doing good. And so they're going to present themselves in the end time as being the children of light. And they're going to follow the God of light. And they're going to be very, you know, zealous in their approach to this, because they think that God is evil and Christians are evil.
Yep. That is such a great point to make. You know, when somebody's deceived, that's the point. They don't know they're deceived. And so they call evil good and good evil, and they think that they are the ones with the information and that we are blind. And so I heard a quote, I think it was L. Ron Hubbard's wife, and it was one of those really high up weird people. And she said, yes, if the Christians don't get on board with evolving their consciousness, yes, they will be put to death, and we won't have a problem with it, because we're trying to evolve and move on in the light and become as one. And so she literally said, we have no problem with that if they want to hold back humanity, and they really believe that.
Yes. Yep.
That's crazy, but it's true.
It's true. And they look at us as mundane, and look at us as cattle, and incapable of evolving into godhood. So
simple-minded, and
so all of the stuff that's being done today is seeds for genocide.
Yep. Simple-minded, intolerant. You know, we've got, they have to turn us into something that is just so offensive, and that's what they do. The liberal agenda will say we're unloving, we're intolerant, it's simple, we're closed-minded, and it's going to work. It is working. And I've seen so many people cringe. If you call yourself a Christian, they automatically think that you have a low IQ, or you're just not enlightened, or you just don't get it. And they're working on the general population to brainwash them in some way. And I've seen it, the anger and the hatred against anyone, because it's okay. Everybody likes to believe in God. You know, everybody wants to hear the word God. They're a good person and you believe in God. And they don't even mind Jesus. If it's the hippie Jesus that, you know, there's no judgment. He didn't really die. There's many ways to God. But if you make him the only way, there's the sword.
Yep.
So they just can't have that.
A better term for it is the Gnostic Jesus, who didn't die on the cross, but who was avatared and brought wisdom as one of those on the ways to help humankind evolve into godhood, and was just another prophet. That's what they, you know, a lot of people don't realize that's Gnostic doctrine.
And that is where Muhammad got it. He got that. All of his revelations, they called him the ear, because he would hear stories in 7th century Arabia, and he would pass them on as revelation. And the same stories, like about Jesus making clay birds, they all come from the Gnostic gospel letters. And you could trace it all back there. So, and it's the same thing. They deny that Jesus is the Son of God, who died for the sins of the world and was buried and rose again as promised through the scriptures. So that's what Paul warns about as another Jesus. There is another Jesus. The Mormons have another Jesus, but it's really only the real Jesus and the false Jesus. two, and they're always the a change of the same version. Like he said, it's the Gnostic Jesus, but you'll have a different version in each one. You have a different one in Islam, you have a different one with the Mormons, etc. But there's only the real one and the false one. But all right, let me see here. Do you think CERN will be successful? You were talking about some of the things that they were attempting to do, and Lori wanted to know if you think they're going to succeed.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Sometimes I think yes, and then other times I think no. But I think if we are, let me sort of back up a step. So a lot of things that happen in the end time, it all come about because of what humans do. It's not this judgment that's coming down. It's what we do that's going to cause all of this. And not we as in Christians, but the people who are running the world for the fallen angels. So, and then you have this CERN thing where they're trying to get into another dimension, I think, into the abyss, and also define this Atma particle with quantum computing and AI and everything that it takes to do that, to work in multiple universes, in multiple searches. So one would think that they're trying to get into the abyss to get the impassioned angels out so that they can bring on the end time, because they want to bring it on sooner than later. And so that's a possibility. But the trouble is, though, is if I look at what Revelation says, is that, the angel with the key to the abyss comes down from heaven. So, and even though the angel falls from heaven, I don't think that's a rebellious angel. I think it's an angel, because if you look at how Revelation lays out with the angels doing things, they're all doing it at the behest of God to let things happen, so that free choice can take place. And that's why everything that is going to happen is going to be done by us and fallen angels. So when the abyss is opened in the last 7 years, in the first 3.5 years of that last 7, I think that key is given from God, but by the angel, to open up the abyss. So I'm thinking, no, they're not going to be as successful as they'd like, but they may find some access to that knowledge that they're going to hook into the beast system. So they may be very successful there.
I was thinking back to when Stephen Hawking, even secular humanists, even atheist scientists are saying they need to stop doing what they're trying to do, because you don't know what you're going to bring in here.
Yeah,
so
they have no idea what they're unleashing. So, but that's what sort of ramps things up, right? It's just going to continue to ramp up with all of this stuff that's going on, and they're not going to stop. So they're driven by their masters, who want to bring about the end time. So they're going to do this.
Wow. Oh my goodness. I've kept you 2.5 hours, and it's almost, it's just going to be midnight in about 20 something minutes. I don't want to keep you too long. Let me see. If they find out they are equal. Someone wrote, if they ever find out they are our equal, we will then perish. They must never know if they ever find out together they can vanquish us, they will take action. I'm not sure what that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the point is there.
Maybe I missed something, but it was in all caps, so I read it. Do you think they are creating hybrids to pass off as aliens?
Yes, I think the alien aspect is part of the Nephilim creatures. I think those are survivors. So I think there's a number of different kinds of them. Also, we must understand that the fallen angels are have that shape-shifting capability, so they can take various forms. So they're probably going to be in amongst it. But there's a hierarchy of the alien mythos, and the elementals would be at the bottom. Those would be the smaller ones, like the gray aliens, which would be like. But there's a whole series of creatures that they've created that I think make up this alien aspect that has this ancient technology. Because, you know, we didn't talk about it in the show tonight, but the knowledge that they had before the flood was greater than what we have today. That's why it's important to understand what's going on with these 7 sciences. And we're just catching up to that level of knowledge right now, to how they corrupted the whole world. We can't build a pyramid today, or Machu Picchu and all the other things that they did to honor their pantheon of gods. So they had an advanced civilization with advanced knowledge that we're just catching up today to the ability to change the DNA and the genomes as they did before the flood. So all of that is sort of that context that you need to understand with what's going on with the aliens and this whole organizational structure of conspiracy and deception that they're bringing about, including this additional knowledge that's going to be, I think, partially given to us by the aliens once they make their formal sort of announcement. We're here to save you, but you got to fight this one last battle.
I agree. And when you said salamander, I was like, oh, gross. That is exactly what they look like, those things. And we have a beloved sister who converted from Islam, and she had a run-in with those things that showed up and were tormenting her. But the name of Jesus took care of it. But those things, they're obviously spiritual. We've had that conversation, and I'd love to do a whole program just on that. But, you know, now she hasn't seen them since. But these things try to pass themselves off as these aliens. And you've got tons of stories from where they were called the Grey Neighbors, like with Scotland,
Yep.
right? They called them the Grey Neighbors. And they had fairy portals, you said. And they little round machines, the little round flying machines. And the technology, I agree with you, because not just the architecture, but there are stories like about Vimanas in the Mahabharata, the little flying machines, and the tops of their temples are supposed to look like those things, right? They're flying machines, the gods' machines they flew around in. I believe that too. And also when, was it Alexander the Great has a recorded account of a bunch of flying round discs supposedly assisting him in some kind of battle. I was reading that a while back. So there's reports of this stuff like ancient, so it's obviously not what they say they are. And I think that you mentioned on this another time in a prior one that they change their story about who they are depending on the culture they're visiting. You know, in time. You know, messengers of deception indeed. What I was reading earlier, I think this is a continuing thing. He was just saying that the elite will hunt down Christians and make it so nobody gives us shelter. And I said it was kind of like in World War II with the Jewish people. They made them enemies and then made the person helping them also an enemy with great punishment for doing so.
And COVID has been great preparation for that. People are already starting doing that, right? So all the birth pangs all the birth pangs will work together so that it's all, so they'll turn against Christians and anybody who stands against the coming world government and coming world religion. They'll be enemies of the world and persecuted.
Absolutely. Well, you guys, it's been 2 hours and 40 minutes, and I'm telling you, I could talk to him all night. And I am so happy we got to get you before you went away for a little while. And I'm glad you're feeling a lot better, Gary. We're so happy when you come to visit with us. And I want to thank the Saints for sending their questions in. But I'm going to hand it to Gary for any closing statements. But before I do, I want to let you know his link for his website is in the description box. His link for autographed copies. Let me get mine. It's so heavy. Oh my goodness, Gary. For his book, you see my little bookmarks in there. The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. If you want an autographed copy, there is a special link for it in there. Otherwise, he can tell you some more places, but you can get it at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any place that sells books. They'll have it They should. And with that being said, Gary, I just wanted to hand it over to you for your closing thoughts.
Well, I want to thank everybody for, tuning in tonight, and hopefully we've raised a little bit of curiosity and got you thinking about a few things. And the whole idea is to plant seeds and have people get curious and do research. So if I can help you, in any way in that, if you want to get a hold of me, you want to ask me a question, or you want one of these documents, just get a hold of me through the website. It may take me a week or so to get back to you with the backlog of messages, but I will get back to you.
Yes, he is very faithful about that. I don't know how you do it, because you have a huger base than I have, and it's very challenging for me. But just being one person, it's really hard to do this. So, but he is very faithful in that, and that was very kind of you to offer that assistance. So you guys, thank you so much for hanging out with us. Remember to pray for Nicholas. I saw that he showed in the chat room tonight. I'm glad you're back, Nicholas. And for Stephanie, who was still in the hospital when I heard from her tonight. So let's keep her in prayer as well. We've had some wonderful brethren do wonderful things for the ministry. That she made these wonderful hats, Jesus plus nothing, perfected forever. So that everybody, it's a good talking point to tell people about Jesus. He's the most wonderful gift the world ever has. And it's good to remind people of that. So let's pray for one another. I was so pleased how kind everyone was in the chat. And I really like the attitude Gary has. Not here to, force you to agree. Just hear each other out. Just hear each other out, and you can agree to disagree if you don't agree with it. But being in disagreement doesn't mean being disagreeable. So I really appreciate everybody and their attitude. I want to thank Hendrix and my super mod and the moderators, Sister Victoria and others. I thank Celine for taking care of the chat room and keeping it a safe place for the saints to hang out. And I will see you guys soon. Don't forget Friday, Fellowship Friday, Fellowship Friday, that's a mouthful, at Church of the Eternally Secure channel, CES, tomorrow at 9:30 p.m. live Eastern Standard Time. I will see you then. And don't forget, links in the description box. If you're having any problem with them, you can email me and I'll make sure you get through to Gary. Okay? God bless you guys. Good night.